In it, Adolf Hitler is embracing a Jewish child called Rosa Bernile Nienau and smiling full of tenderness.
Adolf Hitler, architect of the Holocaust, champion of racial purity, once formed a close, almost affectionate bond with a girl he knew had Jewish ancestry. She called him uncle. He called her sweetheart. For years, they exchanged letters, posed for photographs, and spent time together at his Bavarian mountain retreat. But as Nazi racial laws tightened, her existence became a dangerous contradiction. This is the true story of Bernile Nienau, the Jewish child Hitler once embraced, then erased. Let's discover the birthday meeting that shocked history. On April 20th, 1933, Adolf Hitler stepped out of his Bavarian mountain retreat, a quiet residence tucked into the alpine slopes of Obersalzberg, to greet a small crowd of admirers who had gathered at the gates. The occasion was his 44th birthday. The house, known then as Haus Wachenfeld, had not yet become the heavily guarded Berghof it would later be. Security was still minimal. There were no checkpoints or closed doors, just a handful of people excited to see Germany's newly appointed chancellor. Among them was a 6-year-old girl named Bernile Nienau. She had blonde hair, delicate features, and a shy smile. And, by coincidence or fate, it happened to be her birthday too. That tiny overlap, the shared date of birth, would change her life. Her mother mentioned it casually to Hitler, and for reasons no one has ever been able to fully explain, he was captivated. He invited them past the gates. He welcomed them into his home. And within minutes, a photograph was taken that would soon spread across Germany. The leader of the Nazi party smiling warmly beside a child, one arm resting behind her shoulders. Why would Hitler, a man whose regime would soon revolve around racial purity, take such a visible liking to a child he barely knew? Why would he allow this image of himself and a little girl to become one of the most widely distributed portraits of his early leadership? And most importantly, why did no one stop to ask who she really was? Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, was there that day and immediately saw the value of the scene. He captured several images of the encounter. Hitler crouched beside the girl, laughing with her, speaking to her mother, even inviting them both into the house. These weren't stiff propaganda portraits. They were warm, informal, almost intimate. Hoffmann would go on to publish many of them in officially sanctioned photo books, part of a carefully curated campaign to soften Hitler's public image. By 1933, Hitler had consolidated enough political power to command fear, but not enough emotional connection to inspire loyalty. Photographs like these helped close that gap. They presented him as relatable, paternal, almost gentle, a man of the people, especially children. Bernile's appearance helped seal the illusion. She looked exactly like the Nazi ideal of girlhood, fair, innocent, cheerful, and apparently pure. And yet, nothing about the situation was simple. Over the next few years, Hitler remained in touch with Bernile. She and her mother were invited back to the house multiple times. Letters were exchanged. Photographs continued to be taken. And in public, she was now being referred to by a strange, eerie nickname, the Führer's child. It was whispered in newspapers and sometimes printed outright. In an era when proximity to power meant everything, this little girl was suddenly placed at the symbolic heart of Nazi propaganda, a living image of Hitler's benevolent character. But this carefully crafted relationship carried with it a silent, increasingly dangerous contradiction, because the regime didn't know or didn't want to admit who Bernile really was. Here's the part that makes this story more unsettling than most people realize. Hitler wasn't unaware of her background. As early as 1933, his aides had informed him that Bernile Nienau's maternal grandmother had been born Jewish. According to the emerging racial ideology of the party, which would be written into law 2 years later, this meant that Bernile was not considered fully German. The language of the time was deliberately obscure, but the implication was simple. Bernile was what the Nazis called a Mischling, a term that categorized people of mixed Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry. By the standards of the racial purity laws that would define Nazi rule, this child, the same one standing beside Hitler in official photographs, did not belong in the picture. She wasn't supposed to be the symbol of anything, and yet there she was, smiling, celebrated, and embraced by the highest figure in the regime. So how did this contradiction survive, and for how long? At first, it seems that Hitler didn't care. Despite the warnings, he allowed the relationship to continue. The photos kept circulating. The public interest grew. In her letters to Hitler, some of which survive to this day, Bernile called him affectionate names, thanked him for his kindness, and even sent him hand-knitted gifts. It was a kind of idealized loyalty, offered by a child who had no idea how dangerous her background had become. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, officials were growing nervous. The racial laws were solidifying. The party line was hardening, and Hitler's association with someone who could legally be labeled as non-Aryan was becoming harder and harder to defend. It was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, and one of the most ideologically rigid men in the Nazi inner circle, who finally intervened. He saw the problem clearly and acted to remove it. Without public explanation, Bernile and her mother were quietly cut off. They were told not to return to the Berghof. Contact with senior officials was forbidden. The photos, once proudly published, were withdrawn from new publications. Bormann even attempted to prevent Heinrich Hoffmann from continuing to use Bernile's image in photo albums. The regime was trying to rewrite its own narrative in real time, editing out the pieces that no longer fit. But the damage, in a way, was already done. Hitler, for reasons still debated today, had knowingly spent years associating with a child in a friendship that rejected his entire ideology. And that's the mystery at the heart of this story. So who was Bernile Nienau really? Why was she allowed in, and why was she pushed out? And what does her story tell us about the man behind the propaganda, and the system that eventually turned on its own symbols? The dangerous secret behind the photos. This part of the story wasn't uncovered until recently, and when it was, it shocked even the most seasoned historians. In early 2025, researchers reviewing the personal letters of Adolf Hitler's staff and official correspondence from the Berlin Federal Archives confirmed something long suspected but never fully verified: that Hitler had been explicitly told, as early as 1933, that Bernile Nienau, the child he publicly called Sweetheart, the girl featured in photo albums that circulated across Nazi Germany, was descended from a Jewish family. Not only was she not Aryan under the regime's racial laws, but she was also formally categorized as non-German in the same internal classification system that would later be used to strip others of their rights. This wasn't a misunderstanding. For 5 years, he continued to keep that child in his orbit. Why would the man who built an entire political ideology around racial purity deliberately make an exception? Why did no one stop him? And why did the exception eventually collapse? To understand how shocking this truly is, we need to look at how the Nazi regime defined Jewishness. Contrary to the popular assumption that it was about religion, the truth is far more disturbing. In 1935, 2 years after Hitler met Bernile, the regime passed the Nuremberg Laws, a set of legal definitions that turned ethnicity into law. These weren't just political guidelines. They were enforceable rules written into the German legal code, designed to identify who was and wasn't a true German. The key principle was this: being Jewish was not a matter of belief, but of ancestry. In simple terms, it didn't matter if you had converted to Christianity, didn't attend synagogue, or had no religious connection to Judaism. If you had Jewish grandparents, you were classified as Jewish by blood, and that meant you were excluded. This is where Bernile's story takes a darker turn. Her maternal grandmother, Ida Morgenstern, had been born to Jewish parents. She had later converted to Roman Catholicism, and by the time Bernile was born, the entire family identified as Catholic. But under the Nuremberg racial laws, conversion didn't count. It wasn't enough. Because her grandmother was considered fully Jewish, the classification carried downward. Bernile's mother, Carolina, was labeled a Mischling of the first degree, that is, half Jewish. And Bernile herself was a Mischling of the second degree, a term that meant she was 1/4 Jewish. While this classification technically allowed her to retain some civil rights, unlike those labeled fully Jewish, she could still attend certain schools or obtain Reich citizenship. She was still considered impure under Nazi ideology. She was legally non-Aryan. What makes this so chilling is that her appearance completely defied the Nazi stereotype. Bernile had blonde hair and blue eyes. She smiled softly in every photo. She was polite, well-mannered, and visibly affectionate toward Hitler in her letters. She embodied the image the Nazi regime was trying to sell to the public, the ideal German child. That's exactly what made the truth so dangerous. Because the more popular her image became, the greater the risk that someone, somewhere, would look closely at her background and realize that even Hitler wasn't following his own rules. In the early years, none of this seemed to matter to Hitler. Hoffmann's photographs of Bernile were widely published, particularly in the mid-1930s, when Hitler was still shaping his image as a man of the people. She visited the Berghof, the now fortified version of his mountain residence, several times. She sent him birthday wishes, cards, and at one point even a pair of socks she had knitted herself. At least 17 letters survive, most sent between 1935 and 1939. They were addressed to Hitler's adjutant, Wilhelm Bruckner, who acted as a conduit for personal communications. In them, she expressed nothing but admiration and kindness. To her, he was Uncle Hitler. To him, she was a brief source of calm in an increasingly unstable world. But that illusion couldn't last. By 1938, the Nazi state had begun enforcing its racial policies far more aggressively. Jews were being removed from public life. Jewish businesses were being seized. Children with any Jewish ancestry were being excluded from schools and organizations. The system that had once made exceptions was now tightening. And within the inner circle of power, there was one man who refused to let contradictions slide: Martin Bormann. Bormann was not sentimental. He wasn't interested in public relations, personal loyalties, or moral gray areas. He was a strict enforcer of ideology, and by the late 1930s, he had become Hitler's most powerful secretary and gatekeeper. When Bormann learned of Bernile's ancestry, he moved quickly. He issued a formal ban preventing Bernile and her mother from returning to the Berghof. Contact with senior Nazi officials was cut off. No explanation was given to the public, and no statement was made. The photos stopped. The visits ended. She was erased from view. Even Heinrich Hoffmann, who had built a portion of his career on publishing the Führer's domestic moments.
What we're looking at is one of a series of photographs that were taken in 1927 by Heinrich Hoffmann of Adolf Hitler,
was ordered to stop using Bernile's image. Several of the previously published photo books were withdrawn from circulation. There is even evidence, according to later interviews with Hoffmann, that Bormann pushed to have the original negatives removed from official archives, though some copies had already made their way into private collections by then, which is why they survive today. And what did Hitler do? According to Hoffmann, when told that Bernile would no longer be allowed to visit, Hitler reportedly said, "There are people who have a positive genius for spoiling all my little pleasures." That quote is significant, not just for what it says about Hitler's private feelings, but for what it reveals about the regime. Because even at the highest level, personal attachments were subject to ideology. No matter how fond he may have been of the girl, the party line was absolute. Her bloodline, not her behavior, was what determined her fate. This moment, when Bormann effectively banned the child and attempted to erase her image, marks the point where the Nazi system revealed just how far it was willing to go to control its own narrative. The contradiction had gone too far. A Jewish child, even one quarter, even by a converted grandmother, even with blonde hair and blue eyes, could not be shown next to Hitler without undermining the entire premise of Nazi racial theory. It wasn't that anyone believed Bernile posed a threat. It was that she was a symbol, and symbols had to be carefully managed. What's even more disturbing is that this wasn't the only time the regime quietly rewrote its image to remove inconsistencies. Several other individuals of mixed descent, who had briefly enjoyed proximity to power or protection due to personal relationships, were later excluded, not because of anything they had done, but because the political climate had changed. Loyalty, service, even personal affection didn't matter. Once you fell outside the definition of racial purity, the system had no room for you. So much of what we know about Bernile comes from what was supposed to be hidden: personal correspondence, suppressed photographs, marginal records in the archives. And when you put it all together, the picture that emerges isn't just about one child. It's about a system that couldn't tolerate its own contradictions, and a leader who, for all his control, could never completely escape the consequences of the rules he helped invent. Hitler's carefully managed public image. One of the most effective illusions Adolf Hitler ever pulled off wasn't a military conquest or a political maneuver. It was a personality makeover. And it happened not in parliament or on the battlefield, but through a camera lens. In the 1930s, as Hitler solidified his hold on Germany, a very deliberate effort was made to soften his image, to humanize him, and to present him as something the public could emotionally connect with. A man who appeared warm, grounded, and deeply moral. This was especially important because in real life, Hitler had none of the traditional symbols of emotional stability. He had no wife, no children, no warm family life. To the average German citizen, that could make him seem distant, rigid, even unnatural. And in a time when political leaders were expected to be seen as father figures, that gap in his image needed to be filled. So the Nazi propaganda machine got to work. And at the heart of it was Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's trusted personal photographer. Hoffmann wasn't just snapping random photos, he was building a brand. Through thousands of carefully staged images, he helped construct a portrait of Hitler as a man of loyalty, gentleness, and quiet reflection. These weren't political images of rallies and speeches. They were curated domestic scenes. Hitler feeding deer, walking his dog, relaxing in a sunny garden, sitting beside children, sometimes smiling, sometimes thoughtful, always calm. The man who had orchestrated chaos in the streets of Munich a decade earlier was now being presented as a peaceful guardian of the nation. One of the most frequently used tools in this strategy was the inclusion of animals. Hoffmann often photographed Hitler with his dogs, particularly his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. These photos weren't just casual moments. They were used to reinforce the image of Hitler as kind, gentle, and affectionate. Someone who cared for life. Someone who wasn't capable of cruelty. It was an emotional counterbalance to the increasingly aggressive tone of his policies. And it worked. People believed it. Foreign newspapers, including American and British outlets, sometimes reprinted these photos without questioning them, helping to spread the image internationally. But animals were just one piece of the puzzle. The other, perhaps the more powerful one, was the inclusion of children. Hitler understood that being seen with children could have a powerful psychological effect on the public. It made him seem trustworthy, approachable, protective, especially when the children appeared happy and relaxed around him. Hoffmann made sure to capture many such moments, most of them featuring the children of Nazi officials or household staff. There were images of Hitler playfully teasing the sons of Martin Bormann, chatting with Joseph Goebbels' daughters, or handing out treats to children during holiday visits to his home. These photos were then included in official publications, designed to reach every corner of German life. And this is where the Berghof comes into the picture. Located high in the Bavarian Alps, the Berghof wasn't just Hitler's residence. It was a political theater disguised as a private retreat. The architecture was designed to frame wide mountain views and soft morning light. The gardens were manicured. The paths were lined with flowers. The rooms were built to feel both spacious and serene. It was made to look like the home of a thoughtful man, a peaceful leader, someone who loved nature and tranquility. And this illusion was carefully staged. Every visit by journalists, dignitaries, or film crews was choreographed. Hitler would appear at ease, sometimes reading, sometimes sipping tea, always polite. Even his partner, Eva Braun, was used strategically. Although their relationship was kept mostly out of the press, her presence, behind the scenes, snapping candid home videos with a cine camera, contributed to the visual archive of his domestic life. This version of Hitler, the kind uncle, the shy lover, the thoughtful host, was a carefully calculated contrast to the brutal policies being implemented across Germany. While people were being excluded, isolated, and removed from public life based on race or political affiliation, Hitler was being photographed in the sun with children and animals. It created the impression that he was not only rational, but benevolent. The brutality of the state, then, was framed not as cruelty, but as unfortunate necessity, actions taken by a strong leader who nonetheless had a gentle heart. This is why the case of Bernile Nienau became so powerful and so dangerous. At first, she fit the visual mold perfectly. She had light features, a soft smile, and a quiet elegance. The photos of her with Hitler, taken on his birthday in 1933, were exactly the kind of images the propaganda team wanted. A child showing affection, a leader showing kindness. Hoffmann's camera captured it all. And for years, the public believed that Bernile was the ideal image of German youth. Pure, grateful, loyal. But behind the camera, there was a problem. Bernile wasn't the daughter of a Nazi officer or household worker. She wasn't part of the inner circle. And more importantly, as the racial background of her family became known, it became clear that she didn't belong in the picture at all. The Nuremberg laws had redefined identity in strict genetic terms, and according to those standards, Bernile was not Aryan. She was legally classified as Mischling, of mixed Jewish descent, which meant that every photo of her beside Hitler was not only inconvenient, but potentially explosive. So, the regime rewrote history. Bernile and her mother were banned from further contact. Her name was removed from publications, and the photos banned from further publication. This is where the contradiction becomes clear. Hitler had built a public image on emotional closeness. He wanted to appear fatherly, wise, and morally upright, someone who could be trusted. But the truth is, that version of him only ever existed in photographs. And this is how propaganda works when it's at its most effective. It doesn't always lie directly. Sometimes it tells the truth, but only the parts that fit. Bernile fit the picture until she didn't. And when she didn't, the picture changed. But the fact that we're still talking about her today, that her image still exists, that her letters have been preserved, means the illusion didn't fully succeed. It cracked. And through that crack, we can see something more honest than the image ever showed. The lengths to which a regime will go to keep its contradictions hidden. Nazi racial laws and the politics of blood. The rules that destroyed Bernile Nienau's life were not written in ink. They were written in blood, not literal blood, but the idea of it. In 1935, the Nazi regime passed one of the most radical sets of racial policies ever put into law, the Nuremberg Laws. These laws were about ancestry, about turning family trees into legal documents, and using grandparents' identities to determine who would be allowed to participate in public life and who would be excluded. What made the Nuremberg Laws so different and so dangerous was that they transformed personal identity into a state-controlled category. According to these laws, anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was considered fully Jewish and therefore excluded from Reich citizenship. But even people with fewer Jewish ancestors weren't safe. They were given a different label, Mischlinge, a word that translates roughly as mixed blood. And even within that category, the regime split people into 2 separate classes. Those with 2 Jewish grandparents were Mischlinge of the first degree. Those with only 1 Jewish grandparent were Mischlinge of the second degree. It sounds technical, but it had real consequences, because these categories determined everything: who you could marry, what jobs you could hold, whether you could attend university, whether you were seen as German or simply tolerated. This is where Bernile Nienau and her mother, Carolina, found themselves trapped. Carolina's mother, Bernile's grandmother, was born into a Jewish family. She later converted to Roman Catholicism, but under Nazi law, that conversion meant nothing. The regime considered her racially Jewish because her parents were Jewish. So Carolina, despite being Catholic her entire life, was legally a Mischling of the first degree, half Jewish. And her daughter, Bernile, was a Mischling of the second degree, 1/4 Jewish. At first glance, this classification didn't mean total exclusion. Bernile was still allowed to be a Reich citizen. She could attend school. She wasn't banned from living in certain areas, but there were strict limits. She would never be permitted to marry someone who was considered pure German. She could not join the Nazi Party or be employed in any leadership role. She was not allowed to be part of the SS. In theory, she could live a relatively normal life. But in practice, every path forward was quietly closed off. And more importantly, even this limited tolerance depended entirely on silence. If no one noticed, if no one questioned, if the illusion held, then maybe she could stay. But the moment her ancestry became public knowledge, the protection disappeared. Here's what made this so explosive. Bernile didn't look like what the regime defined as impure. She looked exactly like what they wanted to promote: blonde hair, clear skin, a calm, polite demeanor. In the photographs, she didn't just blend in, she became the symbol. The little girl beside Hitler. The smiling child who represented innocence and loyalty and national pride. And the regime encouraged this at first. Hoffmann published the images. The newspapers hinted at her special connection to the Führer. People believed she was the model child. But when her ancestry was confirmed, and confirmed early in 1933, the image turned from convenient to dangerous. This contradiction couldn't be allowed to continue, especially as the Nazi racial laws grew stricter and the regime's messaging became more rigid. It wasn't enough to control actions. The party wanted to control definitions. And a quarter Jewish girl smiling next to Hitler wasn't just a private matter anymore. It was a visible failure of the entire ideological system. Martin Bormann saw this clearly. As Hitler's private secretary, Bormann was one of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich. And unlike others in the inner circle who sometimes acted out of loyalty or sentiment, Bormann was committed to pure ideological enforcement. He didn't care about photographs, friendships, or public affection. What he cared about was maintaining a consistent racial narrative and protecting Hitler from any appearance of hypocrisy. Once Bormann learned about Bernile's background, he moved quickly. He banned further visits to the Berghof. He cut off access to Hitler. He ordered that no more photographs be published and that existing images be removed from circulation wherever possible. Was Hitler angry? According to some accounts, yes. Hoffmann recalled Hitler expressing frustration, saying something like, "There are people who have a positive genius for spoiling all my little pleasures." But he didn't stop Bormann. The emotional bond, if it ever existed, wasn't strong enough to override the political pressure. And that's where the story becomes so revealing, because even when the regime's leader appeared to break his own rules in private, the system itself forced him back in line. There was no room for inconsistency, no room for exceptions. What makes this even more chilling is the way the law treated religious converts. In a rational system, someone who had left a religious community might be seen differently than someone actively practicing. But in Nazi Germany, none of that mattered. A Jewish person who had converted to Christianity decades earlier was still considered Jewish, not because of faith, but because of genetics. The idea was that identity was unchangeable, that it was inherited, fixed, and biological. The Nazis didn't just persecute belief, they persecuted ancestry. This is what made the laws so difficult to escape. They weren't targeting behavior, they were targeting blood. And so, in the eyes of the regime, Bernile was no longer just a child. She was a threat to the narrative. She revealed a flaw in the logic of racial purity, that identity can't always be seen, that ancestry doesn't follow appearances, and that the system's categories didn't always match the reality in front of them. She had to be removed, not because she did anything wrong, but because her presence highlighted the weakness of an ideology built on invented categories. The irony is almost too sharp to ignore. The Nazi regime spent years promoting a visual standard of purity, and the girl who perfectly matched that image turned out to be one of the very people their laws excluded. The entire idea of racial science collapsed in that moment. Because if a girl like Bernile could be labeled impure, then what did that say about the categories themselves? What did that say about the system? Bormann didn't want to answer those questions. He didn't want the public to ask them either. So he erased the evidence. He enforced ideological consistency, even at the cost of personal relationships. And the photos, once symbols of warmth and connection, were locked away. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.